Today on Gaming the Podcast, we are talking about both video games and about Dungeons and Dragons. Specifically, we're talking about how we interpret each of them differently from one another, both while we're in there playing them and how we think about them when we're not playing them. I'm glad to say, still John Robertson, and I'm to be joined by Stace Harman. Together, we are Indie by Design. We are video game design consultants, and we create books that celebrate the history, culture, and art of video games. You can find out more about us by following us on Twitter. We are at Indie by Design, or by visiting our website, indiebydesign.net. That's enough from me. Here's Stace Harman.
Since last week's podcast, I've been playing a lot more Hitman 3, and we talked last week about how Hitman 3 is designed and how there's this notion of repetition and freedom and how one informs the other, and sometimes they work with each other, sometimes they work against each other. And I've gone back into Hitman and I've been playing it from a much more, self-narrative led way of looking at it. So the goals of each level perhaps have taken a bit of a back seat to the way that I'm going about it. And we talked about this a bit last week, that it's like this toolbox or this toy box of things that you have that can then determine how you can approach any given level. And off the back of that, I mean, you and I both play D&D, and we both played D&D recently, and that brings up some similar points. I think that there's the way that you approach D&D is going to, of course, determine the experience that you have, but on a broader perspective, the way that it's designed, both Hitman, D&D, and video games in general, the way that these things are designed and the fundamentals that underpin the experiences can very heavily influence the way that players approach those experiences. So that's a thing that with Hitman, it's not, I don't think it's immediately obvious that for me, the biggest point is to just play around with it. Like there's a rating system, you get ranked out of 5 stars, but really the core thing for me is that the experiential side of it, it's been designed, I think, to facilitate that almost for me, more sort of specifically than it has been designed for you to get the best ranking. And you played D&D at the weekend, just gone. And is that a thing that you, like when you approach D&D, how are you using those, like the design fundamentals, how are you using that to inform your experience? Are you very much like a rules-based person? Are you more of a experience-based person for D&D?
Yeah. So I think just start by saying D&D meaning Dungeons and Dragons for all the muggles out there.
That's worth iterating.
So yeah, I guess the biggest difference between how I approach D&D in a general sense versus how I might approach a game is that I view them as D&D being a fully open system of design and video games as being a more closed one. And I don't mean that, I know that can sound open and open being positive and closed being negative, but I don't necessarily mean it like that. So I mean openness in relation to D&D, meaning that kind of anything is possible, in that the game is being governed by a dungeon master who is interpreting the rules and only using the rules as written in the books insofar as to create the best experience possible. If the experience is going to be best by making exceptions to those rules and allowing things to happen that go against what the rules say, or even what happened in your previous game, for example, then if it fits the story, the sort of joint storytelling, the collaborative storytelling that everyone's involved in, if it fits that and sort of buffs that and makes that more interesting, then it'll be allowed. Whereas in a game, it's closed in the sense that the rules are the rules and you can't go against those rules. Even in something as open as Hitman, the rules are still the rules. You can't undermine the rules. You can't ask for a free pass on this one. You can't plead your case and say, oh, but it'll be really cool if this happens. Like, no, you can't. It's done. So I think to answer the question more directly, like how do I approach the two things differently? I think, I approach D&D with a sense of if I can legitimize it and I can argue my case as to why it's cool, or just like make it so cool that it's just everyone's just like, yeah, okay, let's just do that, like that's great, and the DM agrees, then you can kind of let your creativity go wild in that space, kind of unrestricted or less restricted. Whereas even in the most open games, like to use RPGs as an example, the most closely related thing to D&D, like even in something like Divinity, I'm still, when I'm thinking about it creatively, you're still working in the constraints of what's possible in the game. So you're immediately second guessing all of the stuff that you're potentially going to do to try to, is the game even going to allow me to do this, or is it just a complete waste of my time trying to think like that?
And do you think is there a different outcome if a video game is bending the rules or allowing you to break the rules, or is breaking those rules on you, or is kind of inflicting broken rules upon you? Is there an outcome other than that seeming unfair or inconsistent that exists? Like, is that the problem?
Yeah,
it's hard to have rules where, this person, I mean, again, to use Hitman, it's like everybody in Hitman can see the same distance. Everybody in Hitman, it's a running joke, but everybody in Hitman has this seeming blind spot for this guy walking around who is obviously a psychopath. I mean, that's something I've seen a lot more of in some of the narrative, some of the dialogue choices, or not choices, but dialogue that plays out. He's being set up very much as a psychopath, and the humor is in the fact that nobody sees that. But and it works because it's consistent. Like, everybody has the same like vision cone, and you can use that not against the game, but you can use that in order to sculpt your own experiences. So yeah, but is there like a time or a place where it feels anything other than unfair if the game is doing that to you?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, it feels, which is odd, because in most video games you have many more tools. You're easily the thing of great power normally for the vast majority of the game. I don't know, take any old game like Metal Gear Solid or whatever. For the vast majority of that game, you're the one with all the power. You're way more powerful than all the grunts that you come up against, and you've got way more tools to use than them. The bosses will often be more powerful than you, in the sense that they've got things that you can't do, and they'll bend the rules, and they've got way more health and all that stuff, and they can just do things that the game had previously said is impossible. But even then, you've almost always got more tools than they have, because you've still got many more means of defeating them than they have against you. They might have like 3 or 4 moves that you can do. You've probably got 10 that you can do against them. But I think, I think when video games present things to you that run contrary to how they've taught you the game runs, then yes, they tend to feel unfair. And I mean, games sometimes use that to their advantage. Like boss fights, again, are I think the one where that's kind of accepted, I guess. I'm thinking like Demon Souls or like Bloodborne and Ninja Gaiden, like games with like really, or even like Zelda, games with like really prominent bosses. They cheat all the time. They literally cheat all the time. Like you fire.
They still cheat within an understandable. I mean, that's I guess where pattern recognition comes from. But they cheat within an understandable matrix of potential results and outcomes. Right. Like it's a question of learning how they're cheating and then adapting your approach to that. Yeah. Rather than like it being, they're never really truly unpredictable, or like, no. There's like, that typical boss design of like phased approach of phase 1 is this, and then they use these attacks, and then phase 2,
and you uncover the big red dot like Resident Evil. Every boss in Resident Evil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but then that's something that I just considered as you were talking then, that perhaps when video games really want to break the rules is when you'll see that in cutscenes. They'll use cutscenes when they want to break the rules and do things that are completely nonsensical. Like you all of a sudden in a cutscene, I don't know, in Metal Gear, you can get disarmed. Like your gun can be knocked out of your hand or something like that. That in the game that doesn't happen. Or a guard can spot you from the other side of the map or high up in a tower and take a pot shot at you. That in the game that doesn't happen. They don't have weapons that fire that far or whatever it might be. So perhaps that's where they're sort of, the breaking of the rules stuff.
Yeah, I guess that's also an interesting difference between video games and D&D, actually, is that those where games would use those more like, okay, we need to take control out of the player's hands now and use a cutscene because we need this thing to happen and it's not going to be very dramatic or high in tension. If we adhere to these rules that the guards can only see 3 feet in front of them and they take ages to reload the weapon or whatever, we need to go around that. Because I guess in D&D that doesn't really happen because you don't really have cutscenes in the same way. And that way, some DMs might use cutscenes, but in D&D, those narrative moments happen under what are largely the same rule set as combat, in that you're still rolling dice, you're still checking the same checks, you're still adding a set of numbers to whatever dice you roll, you're still having to use saving throws and stuff. But yeah, I hadn't really considered that before, but I guess that's an interesting difference, is everything that happens in D&D takes place under this consistent rule set, whereas in games it doesn't. So those inconsistencies in games, I guess, are more visible. They're more open to create sort of like a dissonance in your minds as to when they pop up. Whereas in D&D you don't get that dissonance, because even your charisma check to see if you persuaded the guy might be in your mind thematically very different to the sort of saving throw that you make against an attack. But actually they're the same thing. The mechanics behind them are the same, whereas video games can't really get away with that because they don't have that all-encompassing system that governs everything that they do. And I guess they don't have that because the D&D system is so open to interpretation that they've come up with a system that can include basically everything in this one very customizable system, whereas in games you have to make it much more direct and strict and quote unquote closed in order to create those moments. And again, I don't mean closed as a negative, because like closed does mean that video games can do things that D&D can't, like these incredible escape events that are really high tension and high paced, and they're better. Video games tend to be a bit better balanced and therefore feel fairer often than D&D, and you can have a more authored story that like has a succinct beginning, middle and end that is really dramatic, whereas in D&D it depends on the quality of your group as to how that's going to play out. And there's an important distinction, because as we have already said, and if we haven't, we will now, that it's not that one is better than the other by any means. They lead to different experiences and they lead to different approaches. But that's kind of the point, that you understand, if not going into it, then very quickly, after spending a little bit of time in that world, you come to understand what is and isn't possible through those rule sets. And something like, Skyrim, going up the typical example of like going and speaking to somebody, or anything really, any video game that has dialogue trees, it's important that you understand as the player when you've reached the end of that dialogue tree. And as cliche as it is, and as much as we deride it, because the NPC just stands there on a loop saying the same thing over and over again, we need to understand where the boundaries are, because in a game of D&D, that can just be the DM role-playing an NPC, and being far more kind of, I guess, a far more human reaction is like the NPC getting the ump that you just keep asking them the same questions, or saying to you, like, what are you talking about? And in video games, you don't have that. We need a different marker for saying you've exhausted this line of questioning. It doesn't work like that. Yeah, well, I think in some way that's kind of... I guess it's harder to find a game of D&D that really suits how you want to play than it is to find a game that you really want to play, because with a game you you go in and you submit to the rules of the game, and you know that that's the only way to play. But it's not the only way to play, but the rule systems are there, and the ways of playing are these ways of playing. There's might be more than one way of playing, but there will be a limited number of ways of playing. Whereas in D&D, if you go into it thinking anything is possible, but you want this thing out of that possibility tree, then you might find a hard time with that, because unless you find a game that other people also agree that that's the point of possibility that they also want to engage in, you might be really frustrated. So if you're someone who just keeps asking the DM, this NPC, the same question because they want a specific answer, and you're annoyed because you're treating it like a Skyrim dialogue thing in which you know that this person's got the answer, but they're not telling it to you. So you're annoyed from that video gamey perspective. That might not sit well with people who are there more just for the role play rather than just to sort of min-max the responses that you're getting from all the NPCs all the time. So, so I guess that's another consideration as to how the potential for the way that D&D rules are set up versus how video games are set up is, I think finding a D&D game is hard in that sense, because not everyone, while D&D has got all this range of possibilities, no player wants all of those possibilities. Like they will want a version of that.
Yeah, there's a quote, right? Like it's something to the effect of choices. Too many choices make a tyrant of us all, or something to that effect. That it's understand coming together for a multiplayer game in a video game. Yeah, you're all playing to the same rule set, and you might have an interpretation of approach that means that your experience is slightly different insofar as I might go in all guns blazing, you might go in more stealth or whatever it might be, something, that's quite a basic example, but you're still playing within the rule set that you all understand, and you're coming together. There's like a social contract of you're coming together understanding that. You don't expect anybody on in your ear, if you're playing online, to be moaning about how such and such is unfair because, I don't want to play like that. And it's well, we all understand that that's what the game is. People might complain that something's unfair because you've clipped through a wall, or, people are cheating, as in literally using aim bots or whatever it might be. But there are far fewer complaints about how you're spoiling my fun because I don't want to play the game like that. So, well, that was the sort of the gate. When you came in, the barrier to entry was you understand that you're playing in this way, whereas in D&D you don't necessarily have that. I mean, you can sit down and all talk about that up front, but until you're presented with a situation, you don't necessarily know that the rogue player, all they want to do is come out the shadows, backstab, go back into the shadows, and they're not interested in doing anything else. And for them, that's a good game, and that's fair enough. But for you, that might not be. It might be like, well, actually, I want to see what this guy's got to say for themselves.
Yeah, I'd love to play a game of D&D in which every player just had one move. That's all they wanted to do. Like the rogue only did stealth kills, and the wizard only cast fireball, and the bard only gave bardic inspiration. That's the only things they ever do. It's like, now you're in an audience with the king, and the rogue just tries to assassinate the king, and the wizard fires fireball at the king, and the bard is inspiring everyone while they do it, including the king. That would be quite a funny game. I guess some of the differences between the design fundamentals of how D&D is created to be experienced and how video games are created to be experienced, and obviously it's kind of a fool's errand to try to encapsulate all of video games in one single umbrella as though they're all one and the same design fundamentals. They're not, but I think there are some things that sort of connect the vast majority of them, like the idea of having a fail state and a success state, and probably some sort of ability to determine how much success you got and how much failure you got. Whereas D&D doesn't necessarily have that, based depending on how you play. If you want to play just for the narrative, then there might not be a fail state at all, because even a death, your character dying might not be considered a failure. It might just be a cool narrative moment, and that's amazing. So I guess from that perspective, like if someone's playing like that, do you see, is D&D even a video game? No, it's not a video game. Is D&D even a game at all? Like if someone's literally, if it's just improv, if it's just storytelling and death and failure to defeat the boss and whatever is all just part of an ongoing narrative, and the narrative's really fun and entertaining, then and there's no failure through the normal means of dying or whatever, is D&D, can we even describe it as a game?
Well, I think D&D has the power to be a game, but I don't think that that's all D&D is. And I don't say all in any sort of limiting way, as if that would be a negative if it were just a game, because you can play it very, back in the day, the very, very early experiences of D&D were, I think, far more game-like, because they were far more, you go through this dungeon, you go room by room. They were far more, I think, I wasn't playing at that time, but they seem to be, from what I understand, far more defined by this. These are the rules. You can carry this much stuff. You can, if you're going to have a rest, then you need to potentially make sure that you've closed the door so that you don't get, otherwise you're going to get ambushed. It was far more like, how many rooms have we cleared? How far along this progress track are we? How much loot have we gathered? How much XP have we gained? It was far more like that, and I think that has, not to say that there wasn't a myriad of examples of how you could then roleplay and interpret those rules, of course, but I think D&D has become, as I understand it, has kind of opened out more, and it has grown to be, it's grown to have the potential to be all things to all players to an extent, but even that's not necessarily a good thing. Yeah, 5th edition, and I think the influx of people to it has, and different types of players, people who have never played before watching something like Critical Role, or people who have grown up on video games and played Skyrim and or RPGs and want to replicate some kind of experience like that in D&D. D&D can be that thing for those people, I think, and this is potentially veering into a different conversation, but the question for me there is D&D the best example of that thing that you're looking for? It's the most popular. It's the thing that people know. Like tabletop role-playing games and D&D are synonymous with one another. But the experience you're looking for in D&D, you might be able to get from another tabletop role-playing game better. Like if you want to go into D&D and not really deal with the combat, it's like, well, there's probably better tabletop role-playing games out there for you. You don't need to play D&D. It's just that's everybody's kind of touching point for tabletop role-playing games. So in that sense, yes, I think it can certainly be a game, but I think it can also certainly be an experience that doesn't share a lot of similarities with what we typically understand to be games. So
yeah, I think
it's both.
I think with 5th edition and 5th edition's more D&D 5th edition's more greater focus on improvisation and being a bit lax with the rules and being able to empower players to kind of do these crazy, mad, giant things all the time, rather than sticking to like a rigid rule set of no, your sword can only swipe this far, and no, you can only definitely can't do that, definitely can't push that spell with that spell, and you can't interact in that way between your turns or whatever. Like 5th edition, you can do basically whatever you want. And I think where that really highlights where the difference between that approach to a video game approach is most obvious is actually in the games that try to be like D&D. Like Baldur's Gate 3, for example, in early access now. But take any of them, Divinity and Skyrim, whatever. These games are clearly influenced a lot by, well, as all RPGs are and JRPGs, very influenced by D&D originally. But with Baldur's Gate 3, for example, so in one of my D&D games, I play a bard who's just illusion heavy, just illusions all over the place, and does like loads of crazy stuff with that. And it's really just about what you can creatively conjure up in your mind, sort of brought in check by what the DM will allow. But you can do loads of stuff. Whereas in with illusions, you can do loads of stuff. Whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, you can't really use illusions for anything other than distracting the enemy, because how do they program in a system in which we now will just allow the player to just say, okay, like type in what illusion you want, like what's the illusion going to look like? Well, you can't do that. Yeah. So I think the games that are trying to be most like D&D or are built on D&D rule sets are actually the ones that highlight the differences between the two things more than any other games. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about those games that are based on the rule set. So yeah, like Baldur's Gate and the original 2 Baldur's Gates as well, and Star Wars as well, Knights of the Old Republic. That notion of like, here is a recognizable D&D system that I understand it to be, that there's dice rolls, that there's critical hits, that there's like spell slots and other such kind of furniture that's not just borrowed from D&D, but in some cases is literally D&D's rule set. And that, I think it does, yeah, that can highlight the
that can highlight the restrictions or the differences between playing D&D in real life and playing it in video game form. But I think the advantage it has is that it, even if you don't play D&D and never have and have no interest in that, building something upon the rule set of it that can still appeal to people that's kind of where the freedom comes from. It's like we've got this rule set and people coming into this understand that there is a system in place that's underpinning this. And even if you don't understand the system specifically itself, you understand some of the language of it. You understand some of the, I don't know, if you've got dice rolls turned on in, like, thinking back to the original Baldur's Gate, you would see the dice roll and you would see that it was a natural 19 plus your hit modifier plus your weapon, and equally if you're being hit, there's an armor class value. And so the language that it uses communicates a systems heavy approach, and I don't know, it feels like it kind of allows you to not worry about it. It's like, I don't need to understand these rules, I just need to understand that there are
you can just enjoy engaging with them instead.
Yeah, and it's like that kind of frees, and Divinity I think does that very well. With it frees you up with your approach to problems, because you understand that this is within the rules. Like, the rules are supporting what I'm trying to do, even though the language we tend to use for those things is, you might say, like, oh yeah, well, we skanked that puzzle, or we use this teleporting thing to bypass this entire section. In a game of real life D&D, you would potentially consider that to be clever. Oh, we bypassed this thing by doing this. It would become a narrative kind of point, a narrative sort of victory. But in D&D based games, in terms of video games, I feel like we look at that in a different way, almost like it's cheating, even though it's based on the rules. It's like, oh, well, yeah, we didn't interact with that in the way that we believe as a video game it was intended to be interacted with, even though the rules allowed it. And I think that's another sort of example of not just the rule set, but the design and the thing that you're approaching informs how you view it and how you interpret it as a player. And I think that's...
And I think those strictly implemented rules in games, whether it's D&D rules or a version of D&D rules or whatever rules, have a giant advantage, because like when you do overcome problems within the strict boundaries of the rules, that you do feel clever, like you do feel like, yes, like I've done it, like I've played their game and I've beaten them at their own rules. And that closeness of the rules, like you were saying, like does mean that you can put more effort into how do I overcome a problem? Whereas if the system's really open, like D&D 5th edition, then until you get to a point of extreme knowledge, there's a lot of time just reading, how can I actually do this? Like, okay, I can come up with anything, but I need to understand at some point how I can do it within the rule sets, or what do I need to roll to do this, or what are the limitations on it. So there's a lot of time just messing around, asking the DM doesn't know, you're trying to come up with an idea, a solution at the table, you're trying to refer to rule books and try to figure out what the rules are. So it's messy, whereas in, until you're super confident and you're super au fait with all the rules and stuff, or the rules that you want to use. Whereas in video games, you don't have that. You can just feel safe in the knowledge of, okay, the game's going to take care of that for me, and I'm just going to now just put all of my creative effort, put all of my energy into actions rather than how I perform the actions. That's a huge advantage. That leads to things like you can have, so like suboptimal decisions that you would have in D&D, like I don't know, like you roll your stats up front and you get a 6 or something ridiculous for one of your stats. You might then make that a point of how you're going to play the game. Like, yeah, my person's got 6 charisma, so they are super blunt. They're super, they're whatever it is. And you don't, well... Some people might want to play like that.
Yes, for some people rolling that would be like, oh man, what? That's just ridiculous that I've got this rubbish stat. So yeah, for sure, it's not a given. But D&D allows you to do that. And I mean, are there video games that allow you to do that, like where you
get punished?
So forget the stats thing. Well, this is it. Forget the stats thing. But in terms of suboptimal decisions, Or even, I suppose, even like
so
in a
The
role-playing
Witcher
game.
does a bit. Like you can make decisions in The Witcher that would be like, oh no, like you've now sort of messed up these people's lives in the world. But that does become just like a part of the wider narrative fabric.
Yeah.
And in Divinity it happens as well. But I don't know. But those are not suboptimal decisions that relate to your presence and your ability to impact the world. They're quote unquote suboptimal in that you haven't got the quote unquote good ending. Like for those people, you've got the bad ending. But yeah, I don't know if there's many examples.
I suppose there's even the suboptimal stuff. There is kind of a notion of using that as in D&D. You might say, oh, I don't know, I'm going to try and steal such and such, and your wisdom might be really low, and somebody might be saying to you, this is a really bad idea because we need this person on our side, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to let the dice decide. I'm going to roll this, wisdom saving throw, and I failed, kind of knowing probably I was going to because the odds are stacked against me, literally the number odds based on my stats, and so I'm going to do it anyway. And there's like a playing it for laughs or playing it for like, I'm going to let that decide.
Yeah, well, I guess that comes down to role playing, doesn't it? Because like I think a lot of groups, if you had the low wisdom and it was a wisdom, that was a knowing, the group knew that it was a wisdom check, and the person with the really low wisdom is the one that's going in to do it. And a lot of groups say, what are you doing? Like, you're the one with the really low wisdom, and that's obviously gaming it, which a lot of people don't like. A lot of people are fine with it, so it's whatever you want to do. But it could be that your character with the low wisdom is also got, his or her personality is just really obnoxious and just goes in, doesn't think about the consequences and just bursts in. So like it could be, even if it fails, it could be a great moment in the game. But yeah, I can't really think of many video games that would allow that sort of system where you've quote unquote failed the role. You've gone in and you failed because you're role playing this character that's stats, and then you get a good outcome. Like, to bring it back to Hitman at the start, if you go in and just fumble it, like it's not like, and then you get seen, it's like, well, I'm reloading. Like I'm not just playing this out now.
Yeah. But then, I guess, but that is where your approach to something like Hitman is, if it's goal based to get 5 stars on every level, or if it's, I will see how this plays out and it's more narrative based, potentially you get seen, that becomes its own thing, because you then have, you end up piling up the bodies just to rectify your mistake, as it were.
Yeah, I guess so. But I guess for me the difference is that in Hitman you'll eventually replay that, whether it's starting the whole level again immediately or later. True. Whereas in D&D you can't. Like it's done now.
Well, yeah, and that's actually a key thing, isn't it? That is a key thing, because if you in D&D, if you try and leap over a pit and you fall in, there needs to be a no, you didn't make it, but this happens. Like, there needs to be that. And if there, there needs to be. Yeah, because if there isn't, it's no, you fell into the pit, you got impaled on the spikes, you're dead, the end. In video games, that can happen. As Mario, you can fall down the gap because you're just going to go back and try it again. Yeah.
Tomb Raider 1, I was always falling in pits. God. She didn't have each instance of her reality, each instance of Lara's life in my Tomb Raider is not very long.
Well, that even becomes its own thing, doesn't it? Because here's all the imaginative ways that you can kill Lara Croft. Like, it becomes its own ridiculous sort of set of experiences.
How many imaginative ways have you found to kill Lara Croft? Send your answers on a digital postcard, please, to our Twitter. We are at Indie by Design on all social media platforms. That's at Indie by Design. If you like the episode, then please do leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, as it helps enormously in getting in front of fresh eyes and fresh ears. And if you're interested in books on the art, culture and history of video games, then you should head over to our website, indiebydesign.net. That's indiebydesign.net, where you can find such books made by us for you. Our books include Oddworld Abe's Origins, which is a complete visual history of Oddworld inhabitants, going all the way back to Abe's Odyssey on PS1, all the way up to the upcoming Soulstorm on PS5. And we're also taking pre-orders for 20 Double Fine Years, which is our big book of everything Tim Schafer and Double Fine Productions. Whatever the case though, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you again next week.